Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun làwa mọ̀. Good morning to you, good afternoon to you, and good evening to you from wherever you are joining me from. It is Maiyegun Live. Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube. It will be very much unfair not to conclude this book that we have dedicated over 14 hours so far reading and reviewing. So this afternoon, that is what we're going to do. Conclude the reading and pick whatever you will learn from that history, from it, and make good use of that. For those who have read the book before, this is just a refresher. For those who have never and possibly willing to get it so that they can have it and, process and read it, right? I have advised. This was sent to me from Nigeria. There are bookshops in Nigeria. So just look around for that. It's cheaper and it's easier. Online is a pure rip-off. So, but yeah, we have been following this and we will conclude it. Thank you so much. I know that the reactions have been following last night's broadcast. That is what is expected. I am working on a piece of video that I believe will pretty much help a lot of people answer so many questions too, for those who genuinely want self-determination in Yoruba land. Thank you so much for joining me even on TikTok, and to my friends in the temple right there on Facebook and YouTube. Again, you can listen to this podcast while you do other things, right? You do not really have to sit there and watch, except if you kind of have that free time. This may take us like another, maybe 1 hour, 30 minutes or 2 hours. So we'll make use of that time. Again, I am just going to read, and intermittently, I may be breaking and then, sipping my tea or adding my own review on whatever I have read back to you. So if you can hear me loud and clear, especially on Facebook and YouTube, if you can hear me loud and clear, just raise up your hand and say, yes, you can. So I am going to start now. Thank you so much for joining me once again, everyone. It is a listening podcast now. So while we were reading, when we started this book, we have managed to establish the intention of those who plotted the first coup. It wasn't an ethnic coup, tribal coup, or religious coup. They were simply motivated by what they called nationalism, something they felt could save this new country, newly independent country. But they failed, admittedly. And those who sort of cash in on their revolution twisted it and turned Nigeria to what we are now witnessing today. Somebody once said that, well, the coup plotters themselves are not different. If they had succeeded, there is potential, evidence that Nigeria still won't survive even with them, right? But we will never know. We will never know. They were convinced that they were doing the right thing at the time, but at the end of the day, because they failed, it turned into a tribal, ethnic weaponry against the people of Eastern Nigeria. So that long story, we've seen those who succeeded them too. Those who continued the status quo, the business as usual. So if you haven't probably been part of that 3 episode that we had on this book, I advise you take a look at the diary, okay? Go check. You will see them there. And you can listen like now. Thank you very much. Now let's get it finished. Chapter 8 is where we are going to continue from today. So we've also kind of saw what was about to lead to the Biafra genocide carried out by Gowon. And in fact, this writer, who happened to be the only survivor of the trio that plotted the 1966 coup, January 15, 1966 coup, Adewale Ademoyega. Okay, to him, the war of Biafra and Nigeria was simply the war of personalities. His view, right? So let's continue. So chapter 8, the Liberation Army. Ojukwu declared his secession on May 30, 1967. By that time, the newly created 12 states of Nigeria were 48 hours old and had started to tick, bringing new life, hope, and a new sense of direction to Nigerians. It has been explained by some people that Ojukwu was waiting for Gowon to take the offensive and so become culpable of pushing the matter beyond the brink. Nevertheless, Gowon's action did not give Nigerians and the outside world that impression. After secession, everybody expected that war would follow. Hence, both Biafra and Nigeria were feverishly getting ready. In Biafra, the real enemy was dubbed the Northerner. Consequently, their own defensive efforts were concentrated towards their northern border. At the same time, because of the economic blockade already imposed on Eastern Nigeria, both Port Harcourt and Calabar were being garrisoned. If there was a side less committed to war, it was Nigeria, where formerly 2 of the remaining 3 loyal military governors were opposed to the use of force. Although there was an emergency in Nigeria and no one could really oppose the mobilization for war, yet the military governor of the Midwest states, the newly promoted Brigadier Ejo, assiduously held his ground, refusing to let his state be used as a launching ground for federal military operations against Biafra. Not only that, he saw to it that the officers and men of the Midwest states, a state command, were not committed to the war. This was a proof of courage in a situation where many stooges would too quickly bow down to a superior authority under the pretext that they had no choice. In Biafra, the war fever had been on for nearly a year. Their governor, now head of state, had always assured them that they would fight to the last man, which in some quarters was interpreted to mean that even in the face of defeat, Biafrans would rather die than surrender. Before the outbreak of the war, the meaning of his expression was hidden from their eyes. I myself, talking to my radio in my small detention room in Warri prison, always wondered why Ojukwu was sure that he would be finished, especially adding that when his men were finished, the grass would fight. I kept on wondering whether or not he really meant it. Later on, after I had been released to join in the struggle, I realized that Ojukwu knew what he was talking about. He knew that he was ill-prepared for the fight, and that if it came, he had nothing to send against the enemy except the bodies of his own citizens. No guns, no armor, no planes, no ships. Only flesh and flesh and flesh. What a suicide plot. Or was it a reverse program? Did this have to be so? Despite the fact that about 50 Igbo officers were killed during the counter coup, the region was still superior to the remainder of Nigeria all put together in terms of senior and seasoned officers. A very invaluable foundation for the building of an unbeatable army of liberation. In fact and figures, Biafra had 18 senior officers of the ranks of major, and above all, of whom had been commissioned before independence. In contrast, the federal side had only 7, because about 10 others were kept neutral in the Midwest. On the other hand, Biafra had fewer young officers, captains, and below, numbering less than 70 compared with 220 on the federal side. However, the younger officers were easier to make through accelerated training, which the senior officers could organize. In view of this, while I was confined in detention, I could not conceive of the East as not being ready for war. I saw every reason why they should not merely be ready for war, but should be ready to take the whole of Nigeria by storm. In those days, I still believed that Ojukwu was a soldier, although he was not revolutionary. He had always seemed scholarly and soldierly. And if he had the opportunity as well as the means for a fight, he would not miss it. But I was mistaken. The first root shock to my expectation came in late 1967, in March 1967, when I received the first letter from my friend, Nzeogu. He had been separated from me since March 1966, when we were all dispersed from the maximum prison, security prison at Kirikiri. He was transferred to a destination that I did not know in the East, so we lost contact. However, by March 6, 1967, Ojukwu had unilaterally released all the officers and men that were detained in the East for their parts in the coup. Nzeogu was released along with the others. So he was the first to contact me. By that time, I was the only officer left in detention. That was because I was detained in Warri in the Midwest. 2 of our officers, Major Okafor and Major Anoporo, who were detained in the West, had both been killed in a most brutal way during the July 29 atrocities. Then, in early August, same year, the other ranks who were detained with me in Warri prison were transferred to Benin prison, where they were to be released. Rather, unfortunately, while they awaited their release, some northern troops who came to Benin from Lagos for some special duties broke into Benin prison and carted the detained soldiers away. All of them were badly beaten, many were injured, and some were maimed. After all that, they were left to scuttle away to their homes. The matter infuriated Governor Ejo, but what could he do about it? From that time until August 1967, I was the only military personnel in that prison. And when my colleagues were released in the East in March, I became the only officer left in detention. Ejo did not do anything about me. He did not even send me a word, although he knew I was there. Some officers of the Midwest Command, like Lieutenant Colonel Unwawo, had already visited me there in late 1966 and expressed their hope that those of us still in detention would be released then, but nothing happened. Then at the Aburi meeting of the Supreme Military Council, it was Ojukwu who raised the point that we ought to have been released. Still, Gowon simply promised to look into it. The reason why we were still being detained was not clear to me. It was Ironsi who had cast us into detention, even after he had promised Unzegu that those already detained would immediately be released. He did nothing to release us until he was killed. He did nothing to release us. The rebels of July 29, 1966, then performed a million times worse assault on the officer corps of the Nigerian army than we could be accused of. Yet, not only did they go unpunished for their deeds or misdeeds, they were also elevated. On what moral ground, therefore, were they still detaining us? On what military grounds? No answer, none whatever. After Gowon was installed in power from August 1966, Lieutenant Colonel Banjo made several overtures to him for his release, Banjo's release. Gowon refused to release him, even though Gowon knew perfectly well that Banjo had not played any part in the coup. The only condition he gave Banjo was that the latter could be transferred back to a prison in Lagos. Banjo did not accept the offer. After the Aburi meeting of the Supreme Military Council, there was pressure on Ojukwu to release Unzeogu and co. He agreed and unilaterally released those of us who were in the East. It was an act of great magnanimity on his part, because Eastern region was still in Nigeria at that time. As for the lonely me, I was glad for my colleagues, and I believed very firmly that one of Ojukwu's reasons was that he needed corps of the revolutionary officers and men for his war preparations. Hence, I was shocked beyond belief when I read in Unzeogu's letter that he and his non-Eastern colleagues were sent away on an indefinite leave and were not allowed to take part in preparing for the war. Surprisingly, too, he made me to understand that the East was not really preparing for war. The noise was much, but the military preparation was negligible. After reading through this shocker, I started to ask myself if there was anything of the soldier and not everything of the actor in Emeka Ojukwu. Then I said to myself, if Ojukwu was an actor, then he must be a tragedist and not at all a comedian. I was later proved right. I kept on communicating with my friend, Unzeogu. I gave him my own idea, and he told me the real position of things in the East. He was using an Asaba post office box address. So I did ask him where he was. Inside the post office box office, of course. was his reply. Later, his supposed interview with a journalist called Ejindu was published. I read extract from it in both national and international newspapers. So I congratulated my friend for it and associated myself with his views. He replied that it was not really an interview, but a discussion, and that although the views expressed were his, they were not exactly how he put them. Moreover, the publication had already scandalized him in the East, making the authorities suspicious of him. I could imagine what that meant, seeing that he already had a fame for being able to turn the table against any clever dick whatsoever. I only hoped that they would not rearrest him. No doubt, that publication was partly responsible for their unwillingness to give him any command. We kept up our correspondence until the outbreak of the war on July 6, 1967. 3 weeks later, I heard it over the NBC that Nzeogu had been killed in the Nsukka sector of the war. I was utterly chagrined. Hours later, Biafra denied the report over their own radio. Later on, the federal side confirmed the report and claimed that he was thoroughly identified and that he was given a hero's burial with full military honors. Pictures of him were displayed in the papers. Gowon also paid a tribute to him, saying he was a gallant soldier with principles. Many other Nigerians paid glowing tributes to his memory, and everybody believed that he died a Nigerian, though fighting on the Biafran side. Of course, the federal authority knew that it was they who had confined him inside Biafra, totally against his will. If the Gowon government had released a whole lot of us detained by Ironsi, surely Nzeogu and the remainder of us would have returned to the places of our choice in Nigeria. Not one of us would have been involved in Biafra. Here, I can do no more than say that Nzeogu was a first-class soldier and a trustworthy friend. He was studious, ambitious, temperate, knowledgeable, intelligent, and self-controlled. He was devoid of vices. He was single-minded. He was a born leader of men. Generations of Nigerians will yet read more about him and learn a lot from him. Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogu Adieu. Now, having said this much, let me add this, and let me add that in spite of all that the federal government had published, I was still somehow skeptical about Nzeogu's death. For one thing, I knew that he was not given any command in Biafra. I knew that he was not given any command in Biafra again. For another, the news was denied and never confirmed by Biafra. I was yet to know that Biafra was like that. Consequently, on the day that Major Humphrey Chukwuka, one of the leading officers of the coup, walked into my detention room in Warri, carrying a submachine gun in his hand and in the command of an armed soldier, before I listened to him at all, my first question was, did Nzeogu really die? Yes, he said, in the Nsukka sector. I asked no more questions and was silent for some time. Chukwuka had come to set me free on the day that the liberation had the Midwest. Much earlier, at the outbreak of the war, the prison authorities, who had been extremely kind to me, had told me that since they could not guarantee my safety in the event of the federal troops entering into the area, I should feel free to look after myself. But in the early hours of August 9, 1967, there was noise of rifle fire in Benin, and the news soon spread to Warri. Then it was explained to me that the troops seemed to have come from Biafra. That was a surprise to me, considering that, according to federal sources, Biafra was losing ground rapidly, both in the Nsukka and Ogoja sector. Then again, it was the problem of which side to believe. So the matter lingered with me until Humphrey came into my detention room. I recognized him at once and knew that the Biafrans had entered the Midwest. In a moment, I had packed up and brought out my very heavy box of books, which I had ordered by post from the University of Ibadan bookshop. Actually, I had spent the previous 15 months browsing through the pages of print on every conceivable subject. Surprisingly enough, I found the Holy Bible the most profound of them all. And I found a small book written by a lay woman on the practical realization of the soul, the most useful of them all. I had just successfully performed some experiments according to the teachings of that small book when I was set free. I spent that day with Chukwuka in Warri. He had instructions to send me to Benin as soon as I was released. But he was yet to gather the arms and ammunitions, which he was to send with me. There and then, I understood that all kinds of military stores were in short supply in Biafra. Rifles, machine guns, ammunition, artillery, armored vehicles, planes, and whatnot. I was no longer surprised because Nzeugu had written about this much earlier. We drove to the police station and took possession of all their old Mark IV bolt action, single round rifles, and all the available ammunition. It all amounted to very little. After that, there was nothing else except to choose his own headquarters location. We soon chose a secondary school towards the lagoon side, and there we settled for the night. He went and made a broadcast over the local radio. Soon after, Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, the commander of the Liberation Army, had made his own broadcast from Benin. Early the next morning, I left with 2 vehicles, a few soldiers, and a few weapons that we had collected. I was soon in Benin. At the divisional headquarters, I got another surprise. I met my friend, Ifea Juna. He was wearing a lieutenant colonel rank and was now the chief of staff of 101 Division of Biafran Army, now styled the Liberation Army of Nigeria. He received me very warmly, and we were both glad to be together again. Having been detained for 18 months and having lost all hope of ever soldiering again, there we were in action again as revolutionary soldiers. Once more, we were on the course of liberating Nigeria, and it was a moment of true happiness for both of us. Ifea Juna took me to Edo Polo Army Barrack, where my unit was located. I was to command a newly assembled battalion, which was to be part of the 12th Brigade that was built to forge its way to Ibadan. He introduced me to the men of the battalion. Everybody was a new soldier. The best had been trained for only 5 days. They were merely clothed in military uniforms and brought down. Only a handful of them had any weapons at all. They came in civilian vehicles, mostly cars. That was all. I was to organize them into formation, appoint non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and field commissioned subalterns, lieutenants and second lieutenants. I did not bat an eyelid, but simply went to work at maximum speed. Then I remembered that I myself should be in uniform. But I had none whatsoever, and my men had none to spare. I rushed to the headquarters, got hold of Ifeajuna, and collected a pair of his own uniform, his own spear. When I put it on, it had his new badge of the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Later in the day, the commander sent me a message that I had been promoted Lieutenant Colonel.